Hi, good afternoon. My name is Theron Compton, Acting Forester 2 in the North Central Conservancy. My presentation today is to give some insight into commercial forestry from the perspective of the Forestry Division. So to put some context, the Forestry Division manages the forest resource on the island of Trinidad through the operation of 6 conservancies, which are further subdivided into ranges, while in Tobago, management is carried out by the Department of Natural Resource and Forestry under the THA. Conservancies are tasked with the establishment, silvicultural management, and protection of all state forests in order to maintain ecosystem goods and services derived from them. Forests are managed for either conservation or commercial use, where conservation forestry deals with the protection of ecosystem services. Commercial forestry focuses on the production of ecosystem goods. What are commercial forests? In Trinidad and Tobago, commercial forests are established and managed mainly for timber production. These forests are established in areas which allow for timber to be easily accessed and transported to sawmills, and therefore are primarily located on flat and undulating lands below the 90-meter contour line. In forested areas that lack established roads, logging roads may be constructed to facilitate extraction. Commercial forests are harvested only when the trees are mature and economically viable. Trees are best harvested at their maximum product value. This is the point at which they have reached their total weight and before their growth and health decreases. Harvesting is also based on the silvicultural management system employed and determined by either the age of a particular species, health, presence of deformities, species composition, or combination of all of these. The Forestry Division has established monoculture plantations of Caribbean pine and teak for timber harvesting. These fields are harvested when trees reach 30 and 50 years respectively. This is called the species rotation age. Harvesting of these fields are done using a clear felling silvicultural system. So this illustration would basically highlight all the processes in the clear felling of our pine and teak plantations. Clear felling entails the removal of all trees of the specific species established, leaving a cleared area for future planting. This system favors shade-intolerant species, which flourish in open spaces. Another aspect of our silvicultural management would be the thinning operation. Thinning operations are also performed within our monoculture plantations, which are, as I mentioned before, the Caribbean pine and the teak plantations, during various stages of the plantation's growth, with the aim of improving the health of the tree stock, as well as reducing resource competition. So from the illustration here, you would basically, on the upper illustration, you would identify that the trees within the stand are tightly placed, very little spacing, and you would notice that these illustrations would identify that some of these trees should be removed because they are, as I say, low forked, crooked, as well as poor species representation. So in removal of these trees, you would allow the remaining young trees access to more resources, and you can remove trees that would not be suitable for production at their rotation age. The Forestry Division also practices commercial forestry within the natural forest. Within the natural forest, the division manages the harvesting of local and naturalized tree species by using a block system, an enrichment system, shelterwood system, or combination of these. Additionally, the Forestry Division utilizes minimum girth or diameter limits to control the harvesting of specific species within the natural forest. Here's an illustration of one type of silvicultural system that is used within the natural forest. This is the shelterwood system. This may be used together with the block system within the natural forest. The shelterwood system is used for shade-tolerant hardwood species. Every 20 to 30 years, individual mature and unhealthy trees are removed. The growth rate and quality of the remaining trees improves due to reduced competition, and the young trees of the shade-tolerant species become established in the shaded understory. Selection cutting imitates minor natural disturbances like wind, disease, and perpetuates an all-aged tolerant hardwood forest. Another silvicultural system is the nursery shelterwood. This system encourages the development of 2 stories in a stand, each containing a different species or mix of species. With these systems, shade-intolerant species tend to make up the overstory, which is the upper level, with the shade-tolerant climax species making up the understory. The Forestry Division offers its services to persons and industries who wish to acquire timber from both state-owned and privately owned forests. Access to timber from all lands are guided by legislation and executed using the policies within the Forestry Division. The services offered by the Forestry Division can be separated by those who wish to access material from state lands and private lands. The following slides seek to outline the services provided to licensees, lease landholders, and sawmillers as it pertains to the harvesting of timber from state forests. Licensees, also referred to as woodworkers, are individuals who operate on a small scale, and their access to timber from state land is based on the silvicultural management within the natural forest. Licensees are the preferred operator by the division to remove timber from the natural forest as they traditionally use smaller equipment which reduce the human impact of the forested environment. Licensees also operate on a cubicle or license limit to remove lumber from the natural forest. Licensees do not need a license to operate, and they only convert timber to trees and not trees to lumber. Licensees need to be on an approved list, which is authorized by our FRIM section, which is the Forest Resource and Inventory Management section, and licensees are restricted to the range. As I would have highlighted previously, each conservancy is further subdivided into ranges, and licensees are range specific in that they would have applied to operate in a specific conservancy and a specific range, and therefore they can only operate within those ranges unless otherwise authorized by head of section. So here's an illustration showing the process for a licensee to access timber from state forests. So number one, firstly, there must be approval from FRIM, allowing the range to conduct sales within their boundaries. Each range would have its own approved list, which is created following set guidelines by the division. The officer in charge of a range where sales is approved would inform licensees of the division's intent to allow access to its forests. The licensee then can make a written request to purchase trees within the specific range he or she is assigned to. So here we have the application process, which is submitted to the range office. Once the application is approved, the forest officer would set an appointment for the stamping of trees. The stamping of trees is an operation where the officer would go with the licensee, identify the trees, and once they are suitable, there is a marking that would be affixed by the forest officer to the trees, which would permit the licensee to fell the trees or cut the trees. After this appointment is set, a Form 9 license, which is the prescribed form for this type of operation, is opened and recorded in the Register of Licenses. The Register of Licenses would be kept by the forest officer at his office, and it would make up the record of all the transactions that would have been carried out in that specific range with that specific licensee. Forest officers will then issue serial numbers, initials, and measures, stamps, and record standing trees in his DRF and license. So number 8 would basically be a form of record keeping by the forest officer. If selected trees or tree is not suitable for sale, the licensee is allowed to select a replacement tree. The licensee would then pay what is termed royalty, which is the monies that would be prescribed for a specific cubic, for a specific species, and the VAT. The receipt is then returned to the officer. The licensee would proceed to fell the stamp tree. Logs are then released by the officer, and the remaining unmarketable timber seized by the Forestry Division. A removal permit is issued for the removal of all logs from the stump to the roadside, and then a final royalty and VAT payment would be made for the logs to then be removed from the logging depot and transported to the sawmill, where it would then be refashioned. In this process, there are the issuance of 2 removal permits, which would be explained further on in the presentation. There's an initial removal permit from stump to roadside. This permit, there is no cost attached to it. However, the subsequent permit from roadside to sawmill, there is a $30 cost attached to it. This is a list of the ranges where there are open sales in the state natural forest, right? In the previous slide, or the second slide, I would have identified that there were 6 conservancies. In this slide, you will notice that there are only 4 conservancies where sales would still be open. Based on the direction of various sections, sales can be closed or opened by the conservator at any point in each of these ranges and in each of these conservancies. Now we move on to the process for lease landholders to access material from state forests. For sale of material to occupants of leased land, the process is similar to that of the licensee. However, the application process must first be initiated with the State Land section of the Ministry of Agriculture. The reason for this is that the lease landholder is a tenant of the Commissioner of State Lands, who is the landlord for all state lands. So firstly, the lease landholder, upon identifying if there are any trees on his property that he would like to have access to and transport to a sawmill for the conversion from timber to lumber, an application must first be sent through the officer assigned to that area. Then that application, once completed by the State Land section, it would be sent across to the Forestry Division, to the Conservator of Forests for approval. This application will then be sent to the subsequent or relevant conservancy, where the head of that section, known as the ACF, the Assistant Conservator of Forests, would then pass it down to the relevant officer when his inspection is done. The application is then sent back to the conservator with recommendations whether we approve or deny the removal, the felling and removal of the trees identified by the lease landholder. Once this application and recommendation is accepted, we would go through the same steps as for a licensee, from steps 6 to 12, for the produce to be accessed by the licensee. Sawmillers wishing to acquire timber from state forests do so either through the purchase from licensees or via a timber sales agreement with the Forestry Division. The timber sales agreement, also referred to as bulk sales, allow licensed sawmills to access the pine and teak plantations only. Bulk sales employ the clear felling system of harvesting and permits the use of larger equipment for this purpose. These operations are time-specific so as to reduce the impact the operation has on the forest environment. One of the things that need to be noted or should be noted is that the sawmill must have a license which is given to them, issued to them by the Forestry Division. Sawmillers differ from the licensee in that they convert their trees to timber or logs, and then those logs are further broken down into lumber. Fields awarded in the bulk sales system are done through a lottery system. And the sawmillers are guided by a contract which they sign between themselves and the Conservator of Forests. This illustration gives a step-by-step breakdown as to the process involved in bulk sales. So firstly, an award contract is received by the ACF and forwarded to the respective range officer. The contract can only be sent down once the relevant sawmiller was awarded the field and has agreed to accept that field and signs the contract. The coop awarded to the sawmiller is verified and a loading bay identified for the sawmiller to pull his logs, his cut logs, from the field to the closest roadside for inspection and measurement. Officers would verify all the documents to ensure that the sawmiller is in full compliance with the legislation set out for the Forestry Division, and that all relevant payments pertaining to the operation were paid. The sawmiller is then given an appointment and a license is opened, which initiates the process, the bulk sales process. The officer would then issue serial numbers as designated by the timber sales agreement and the officer's initials. The officer would measure and record logs, royalty and VAT calculated and paid, and logs are released and permits issued based on this operation. It must be noted that all timber shall be paid for before release and issuing of any removal permit. It should also be mentioned that there is one payment made for the removal of timber during the bulk sales operation. That is called a bulk sales removal permit that is paid before any operation is commenced in the field. Step 4 to 6 is repeated until the field is said to be completely harvested. The contractor indicates, once the contractor indicates that the field has been clear-felled, a final payment is made and a completion certificate is requested. This completion certificate will be endorsed by all the officers involved in the operation as well as the head of section, which would then allow the contractor a release of his bond as well as make him viable for any further lottery systems pertaining to the bulk sales operation. So the completion certificate document is prepared and submitted by the Forester Tree and submitted to the Forester Tree by the releasing officer. The Forester Tree would inspect the field to make sure that all marketable material was extracted and the agreements in the timber sales agreement was honored. The certificate is then signed off by the Conservancy and sent to the Forestry Office. And that would complete the bulk sales process. It should also be noted that the Forestry Division also permits the purchase and removal of material from state forests that are designated minor forest produce. In addition to what is on the slide, the division allows the controlled harvesting of vines such as Sijan and Mamu vines, ferns, palms, roseau stems, woody stems for pickets, and wood for charcoal and firewood. Minor forest produce locally are not harvested on a commercial scale. It would usually be persons who would be involved in craft, as well as those persons who would be involved in the charcoal industry, or persons who may still request woods for fire for whatever purpose. Right? But the Forestry Division entertains the public, members of the public, to have access to these minor forest produce. So we want to move on from the operations, the commercial operations for state produce, and bring some information as it pertains to private landowners. Private landowners are required by law to access a private removal permit if they wish to have logs removed from their lands and carried to a sawmill to be refashioned. This illustration shows the process by which private landowners can access private removal permits. So firstly, the landowner and or the applicant will make an application for the private removal permit on an application form, a prescribed form, with accompanying documents, which are, and the original and photocopies of these documents are to be brought to the relevant office. Of the original deed, an updated land tax receipt, list of species and corresponding measurements. This application will then be approved or denied by the forest officer in charge. Upon approval, an appointment is made to verify land boundaries, species, and measurements. Log volumes are calculated and vouchers for payments issued to the applicant and or owner. Officers release logs using a private lands die after verification of payment and issues private removal permits for removal to the sawmill. The private land die hammer is a specific marking that the forest officer would affix onto all logs issued on the private removal permit. Here is an example of the private removal application. You would notice that there are two areas for signatures. The one on top would be the applicant's signature, and below the signature by the owner. So the first step is the completion of the application by the owner and or applicant. An application can be made either by the owner of the private land or individuals who are not the owner, but with the permission of the owner. Applications will be received by the officer in charge of the range where the private land is located on the designated office day for that range. Where the landowner is the applicant, they will sign the application form in the space provided for the applicant and for the owner. An applicant who is not the owner must provide from the owner a statutory declaration or a letter of consent prepared by an attorney, a power of attorney, or notary public. The supporting documents that are required for the receipt and process of an application would include, as I would have stated in the process, the original land deed, original certificate of title, photo ID, the most recent land tax payment receipt, and the list of logs to be removed. In a situation where the original owner or one of the owners, if the land is owned by more than one person, accompanying death certificate will be required. If there is only one person named on the certificate of title or deed, that person is considered the owner. No person should attempt to utilize tenancy documents that are not in their name for this transaction. If tenancy documents show that more than one person is sharing ownership, the applicant must provide a statutory declaration or letter of consent from the joint owners, attorney of law, or notary public for those landowners living internationally, giving consent to apply for the relevant permits. Where an applicant is not himself the owner of the property, he is required to sign the application form together with the owner in the appropriate places. In this instance, the owner must present a statutory declaration from a registered justice of the peace, giving permission to the applicant to apply for the removal permits. For companies that own private lands, in addition to all the other criteria, must have the most recent articles of incorporation, and memorandum of association documents presented to the officer. So here's an example of a statutory declaration that can be provided if there is an issue with the tenancy of the land. For example, if the documents, the land tenancy documents are in probate, or otherwise an original is not available to the landowner, you'll basically identify the land, the persons who are identified as the tenants on the property, as well as you will give specifics as to the location of the land and the adjoining lands that would be found within attached to the certificated title or the deed. Additionally, in the statutory declaration, you would basically highlight if the owner is giving permission to an applicant, you would basically highlight the name of the applicant as well and identify that you are giving him permission to cut and remove the material from the property. Right, so here is just an example of the last land tax receipt, which would be in 2009, since the government has not started back the land tax receipt system. A landowner must present the most recent land tax receipt. However, if a receipt is not available, you can make a request to the District Revenue Office for official copies of payment information. Individuals who have outstanding land tax will not be facilitated until such time as their tax arrears has come up to date. Here we have an example of the list of logs that should also accompany the application for the private removal permit. The list of logs should be legibly written on the application form in the appropriate space, provided that the space is sufficient. If the space provided is not sufficient, the list of logs can be supplied separately. Where the list of logs is separate from the application form, it must also be legibly written or typed with log numbered sequentially and grouped by species. The list of logs must also be signed and certified in front of the officer by the owner. Where an applicant is not the owner, the list of logs should also form part of the statutory declaration. So here are some points to note. Each private removal permit has a cost attached of $30. The maximum number of cubic feet or hoppers feet of timber allowed on the first permit is 416 hoppers feet and 277 hoppers feet on each additional permit. A private removal permit is valid for 30 days, and upon expiry, permits may be extended for a maximum of 2 weeks at a cost of $10 per week. Officers have up to 21 days to verify information and issue permits. And permits cannot be reused. So here's just an example of what a completed private removal permit would look like. A valid permit would have entries from the forest officer showing the date, the area where the logs will be removed from, or the address of the owner, the sawmill to which the logs will be carried, number of logs, species, dimension, and volume. You would also have the officer's signature attached. So one of the information that will be placed on the license and would also accompany the application would be the measurements of the logs. Log lengths will be measured to the nearest inch and up to the longest point on the log. Log circumference will be measured on the small end if logs are less than 18 feet in total length. If logs are 18 feet and over, the log circumference will be measured at the midpoint or in the center of the logs. So the illustration would just identify logs less than 18 feet in length or logs that are from 17 feet 6 inches would measure the smaller end, and anything above that will measure in mid-length. Logs must also be marked with the applicant's initial and be numbered sequentially and grouped by species. The markings should be placed on both faces of the logs with legible writing and characters no less than 3 inches in size. Markings should be made with oil paint or any other permanent method of marking. Where the face of the log is not of a sufficient size to accommodate these markings, the side of the log can be blazed on both ends and markings can be affixed there. An important note also is that there are some offenses prescribed or ascribed to the private removal process. And these will be found in the Forest Act, Chapter 6601, Section 7F. Section 7F1 would identify the maximum cubic to be placed on a permit. As I would have stated before, the first permit for the private removal would allow 416 hoppers cubic feet, with each successive permit being allowed 277 hoppers cubic feet. In Section 7F4, a person who contravenes this section is guilty of an offense and is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $10,000. In Section A, it identifies any person who fells, cuts, girdles, barks, lops, taps or bleeds any tree or injures by fire or otherwise any tree or timber, and causes any damage or negligence through the dragging or cutting of trees, kindles or creates any fire during the season which has not been designated by the minister, is liable to a fine of $20,000 if the act is committed in the forest reserve or state lands. And any person who knowingly counterfeits upon any tree or timber or has in his possession any implement for counterfeiting a mark used by a forest officer is subject to a fine of $50,000 or 2 years imprisonment. So here is some general information for those who may not be aware. This table seeks to outline the conservancy, the range, the office day, and the location of the office day by range. So in the Northwest Conservancy, there are 3 ranges, and they identify the office day and the location. So the breakdown goes by ranges. So for every range, there would be a specific location and a specific office day, which persons who wish to access the services provided by the Forestry Division can go and meet the relevant officer on those days and seek any assistance that is necessary. This slide provides the contact number where you all can get further information for the specific services within your area. And as I come to the end of my presentation, I would try to answer any questions that would have been asked during my presentation. But I would leave this slide up for persons who are interested. You could take down the relevant information as to the conservancy, range, office day, and contact information. Do you have any question? All right. So we had one question from a Diane Ganga Prasad, and Diane would have asked, could the spouse of the deceased lease make an application? So I would believe that, as I say lease, that this person was a legitimate lease landholder and you are the occupant. You would remain as the occupant of the property, seeing that the person was your spouse. Yes, your application can still be forwarded to the state land section for processing because you were married to the leaseholder, and based on their the arrangements that they would have had, they would authorize you to carry out the transaction. So the application will be completed by them and forwarded to the Forestry Division. And from that aspect, we would recommend whether or not the trees can be felled and removed by you. But the initial application would have to go through state lands and they would make the judgment based on that. Any other questions? All right. Well, seeing that there are no other questions, well, I think we could leave it open for a few more minutes to see if anybody have any other questions. Nothing? So I would just go back to this slide here, which would provide the location of the forest offices or the offices for the subsequent, for each conservancy range. So persons can take down the information if they wish. Anything else? All right, well, so I wish to thank everyone who would have logged on for my presentation today, and I hope that it was informative. And if there's any further information that persons wish to receive, please feel free to contact your relevant forestry office and get in contact with the officers who would be servicing your requirements. Just now we have a question. Could probably put it up. All right, so from Mr. Steve Hiralal, the question was, what is ministry doing about people cutting teak, felling teak? Well, I'm guessing, well, that's state land. In every conservancy, you would have officers assigned to the specific range. So if you have information about persons who are illegally felling any tree within the state forest, you should make all attempts to contact the relevant forestry office and give them as much information as possible so that they can act on it. In certain instances, officers may be willing to give their personal cell numbers, especially for the occurrence of illegal activities during the holidays and on weekends or after normal working hours, but that is dependent on the forest officer in that location, right? But you should try to contact one of these forest officers and give them as much information as you can about the alleged illegal activity. All right, so if that is all the questions, again, I would like to thank persons for logging in for my presentation. Thank you very much.